The measuring tape made a sharp snapping sound as my sister Kavya pulled it taut across Grandma's old living room window, her expression radiating the satisfaction of someone claiming territory they believed was rightfully theirs. 24 inches, she announced to her husband Dev, who dutifully recorded the measurement in his phone. Perfect for those blackout curtains I saw at Restoration Hardware. This room gets too much morning sun. I watched from the doorway, sipping coffee from Grandma's favorite mug, as my family systematically planned their occupation of the Victorian house that had sheltered 3 generations of our family. What they didn't know was that I'd been the legal owner for 18 months, ever since quietly purchasing it from the estate through my property investment firm. Maya, you'll need to clear out all this old furniture before we move in next month, Kavya continued, gesturing dismissively at the antique pieces I'd spent thousands restoring. Most of it's too outdated for our aesthetic. Our aesthetic. As if the house were a collaborative project rather than my private residence that I'd been renovating room by room while they assumed I was still renting a studio apartment across town. When exactly are you planning to move in? I asked, genuinely curious about the timeline they'd constructed without consulting the actual owner. Mom looked up from the kitchen where she'd been opening cabinets and making inventory lists. Next weekend, obviously. We can't keep paying rent on Dev's corporate housing when we have a family home sitting empty. Family home sitting empty. I'd been living here full-time for 6 months, working from the converted sunroom office and hosting virtual board meetings with my real estate development company from the dining room where Grandma used to serve Sunday dinners. The whole situation has been ridiculous, Dad added, emerging from what used to be Grandpa's study with a box of financial documents. Lawyers dragging their feet with the estate settlement while this beautiful house just sits vacant. Vacant. Last night I'd fallen asleep in the master bedroom after reviewing acquisition proposals for 3 commercial properties downtown. This morning I'd taken calls with contractors about the kitchen renovation scheduled to begin Monday. At least now we can finally put it to good use, Kavya said, measuring the dining room archway. Dev's promotion means we can afford the maintenance costs, and I've always loved this neighborhood. Dev's promotion to senior marketing director at a mid-tier consulting firm was impressive by normal standards, but wouldn't have qualified him for a mortgage on a house currently appraised at $1.8 million. What would qualify him was the assumption that family inheritance meant automatic ownership transfer to whoever needed it most. Maya, we'll need you to coordinate with the utility companies about transferring service, Mom continued, treating me like an unpaid administrative assistant. And someone should contact that landscaping crew Grandma used. The gardens are getting overgrown. The landscaping crew I'd hired 3 weeks ago to restore the Heritage Rose Garden, which had suffered from 2 years of neglect during Grandma's final illness. The same crew that had installed irrigation systems and created detailed maintenance schedules for the extensive perennial borders. My phone buzzed with a text from my attorney. Courier arriving with documentation at 2:30 p.m. as requested. All papers in order. Perfect timing. Kavya and Dev had scheduled their final measurements for this afternoon, planning to return tomorrow with moving trucks and enough confidence to redecorate a house they'd never actually inherited. I should mention, I said casually, that there might be some legal complications with the estate transfer. The measuring tape paused mid-extension. What kind of complications? Dad's voice carried the sharp edge he reserved for obstacles that threatened his plans. Nothing major. Just some paperwork that needs to be reviewed. Kavya's expression shifted to the impatient annoyance she displayed when dealing with bureaucratic delays. Maya, we can't postpone the move-in indefinitely. Dev's lease expires next Friday and we've already given notice. Notice? They terminated their current housing arrangements based on the assumption that family property automatically transferred to whoever needed it most, regardless of actual ownership documentation. The paperwork should arrive this afternoon, I said, checking my phone again. We can review everything then. Fine, Kavya sighed dramatically. But I'm not changing our timeline for some technicality. This house has been sitting empty too long already. I glanced around the living room, noting the laptop charging station I'd installed last month, the custom bookshelves lined with my graduate school textbooks, and the framed architectural plans for the second-floor renovation currently under review by the Historic Preservation Committee. At 2:25, I positioned myself near the front window where I could watch for the courier while my family continued their detailed planning for a move-in that would never happen. The afternoon planning session evolved into a full-scale occupation strategy, with my family treating the house like a complex logistical challenge that required military-level coordination. Kavya had produced a 3-ring binder titled Heritage House Project, containing floor plans, furniture layouts, and renovation timelines that would have impressed a professional project manager. "The master bedroom needs complete updating," she announced, leading the group upstairs while I followed at a distance. "That wallpaper is absolutely ancient and the carpet has to go." The wallpaper she dismissed as ancient was actually hand-printed William Morris reproduction paper I'd commissioned from a specialty firm in London. The carpet she wanted to remove was restored 19th-century Axminster that had cost more than most people's cars. "Maya, we'll need to coordinate dumpster rental for all this old stuff," Dev added, photographing my carefully curated antique collection like evidence from a crime scene. Mom emerged from the walk-in closet with an expression of mild horror. "Kavya darling, we'll have to gut this entire space. The storage system is completely inadequate for a modern wardrobe." The storage system she criticized was a custom-designed closet organization solution that had been featured in Architectural Digest's Historic Homes, Modern Living article 6 months ago. "That's why we budgeted extra for renovations," Kavya replied, measuring the bedroom's dimensions with the systematic precision of someone planning major construction. "Dev's promotion bonus should cover most of the updates." Dev's bonus, which he'd mentioned was approximately $15,000, wouldn't cover the cost of replacing one of the room's restored original windows, much less funding the comprehensive renovation Kavya had outlined. Uncle Ravi arrived at 2 p.m. with his contractor friend Mike, who apparently specialized in modernizing vintage properties. They wandered through the house making notes about load-bearing walls that could be removed, outdated electrical systems that needed replacement, and inefficient room layouts that could be improved through strategic demolition. "This place has incredible potential," Mike told Uncle Ravi while gesturing toward the hand-carved mahogany staircase. "Strip out all this ornate Victorian stuff, open up the floor plan, add some contemporary lighting. You could really transform the space." Transform. They wanted to gut a historically designated property that I'd spent 2 years restoring to museum-quality standards, replacing irreplaceable architectural details with generic modern fixtures. "What's the timeline for getting started?" Uncle Ravi asked, apparently assuming that family enthusiasm was sufficient authorization for major construction projects. "Depends on permits," Mike replied, knocking on walls to test their structural integrity. "But we could have demo crews here by next month if we move fast." Demo crews. I watched Mike examine the original plaster walls that had required 6 months of specialized restoration work, imagining his crews attacking them with sledgehammers and power tools. At 2:25, I excused myself to use the bathroom, actually positioning myself near the front window where I could monitor the street for the courier's arrival. Through the glass, I could see neighbors returning from weekend activities, unaware that the house they knew as my carefully maintained residence was currently being discussed like abandoned property ripe for development. "Paya." Kavya's voice carried from the kitchen. "Come look at this pantry situation. We're going to need major cabinet work." The pantry situation she wanted me to examine was actually a restored butler's pantry with original cabinetry that had been featured in 3 separate magazine articles about historic preservation techniques. "Also," she continued as I rejoined the group, "we should talk about dividing up Grandma's personal items. I know you've been sentimental about keeping everything, but we need to be practical about storage space." Sentimental. I'd been carefully preserving and cataloging Grandma's belongings according to museum archival standards, not hoarding them out of emotional attachment. At 2:30 exactly, the doorbell rang. "Are you expecting someone?" Dad asked, looking annoyed by the interruption to their planning session. "The paperwork I mentioned," I said, walking toward the front door where a uniformed courier waited with a manila envelope that would dramatically alter the afternoon's trajectory. "Maya Chen?" the courier asked, checking his delivery receipt against my ID. "That's correct." I signed for the package while my family gathered behind me, their curiosity about the mysterious legal documents temporarily overriding their renovation enthusiasm. "What kind of paperwork requires courier delivery?" Kavya asked suspiciously. "Property documentation," I replied, opening the envelope to reveal the beautifully printed title deed that would end their planning session permanently. The envelope contained more than just title documentation. My attorney had included the complete ownership history, property tax records, and insurance documentation that together painted an undeniable picture of legal ownership spanning 18 months. What exactly are those papers? Dad asked, his surgeon's instincts recognizing the significance of official documentation even before understanding its contents. I handed him the title deed, watching his expression shift from mild curiosity to complete bewilderment as he processed the information printed in formal legal language. This says Maya Chin, sole owner, he read aloud, his voice growing quieter with each word. Purchase date January 15, 2023. Purchase price. He paused, apparently struggling with the number. $1.6 million. The silence that followed was so profound I could hear the vintage grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, marking the seconds as my family's assumptions crumbled around them. There must be some mistake, Mom said finally, the words emerging with the careful precision of someone trying to maintain control of a rapidly deteriorating situation. No mistake. I retrieved additional documents from the envelope. Here's the mortgage documentation, property insurance, and tax records. All in my name. Kavya snatched the papers from Dad's hands, scanning them with the desperate intensity of someone searching for loopholes in an impossible reality. Maya, this doesn't make sense. You work in tech support. You can't afford a house like this. Tech support. For 3 years, my family had assumed my technology consulting firm was an entry-level IT job, despite my attempts to explain the difference between technical support and enterprise software development. Chin Digital Solutions has 43 employees and revenue of $18 million annually, I said matter-of-factly. The house purchase was a business investment in historic property preservation. Dev's phone slipped from his hands, clattering on the hardwood floors I'd had professionally restored by craftsmen who specialized in 19th-century techniques. 43 employees? Uncle Ravi's voice cracked slightly. Maya, we assumed you worked for someone else's company. You never asked about my company. You asked about my computer job. Mom sank onto the antique settee she'd been planning to replace with modern furniture. But you drive that old Honda and you never talk about money? I drive a 2019 Accord because reliable transportation serves my needs, and I don't discuss money because every family conversation becomes a request for loans. The truth hung in the air like smoke from a fire none of them had seen coming. So when we were measuring for curtains, Kavya's voice trailed off as the implications fully registered. You were planning to redecorate my house without permission, yes. Mike, the contractor, cleared his throat awkwardly. I should probably head out. Seems like this is a family matter. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone, Maya, I'm calling the police. These people were planning to move into my house without authorization and discussing demolition of my property. Maya, don't be ridiculous, Dad spluttered. We're family. Family members who assumed they could take possession of my home based on wishful thinking rather than legal ownership. I showed them the security camera footage I'd been recording through my smart home system. I have documentation of your entire planning session, including discussions about removing me from my own property. The Victorian house that had witnessed 3 generations of family gatherings was about to witness something entirely different. The police arrived 20 minutes later, though by then my family had begun the awkward process of collecting their measuring tapes and planning materials while trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. No charges will be filed, I told the responding officer, but I want documentation that these individuals do not have permission to enter this property. Officer Martinez nodded professionally while taking notes that would prevent any future misunderstandings about family access rights. The aftermath unfolded with predictable consequences. Kavya and Dev's lease termination became a crisis when they discovered that alternative housing in their price range didn't exist in the neighborhood they'd assumed they could afford. They ended up in a suburban apartment complex 40 minutes from Dev's office. Uncle Ravi's contractor friend lost credibility when word spread that he'd nearly begun demolition work on a historically protected property without proper permits or owner authorization. Dad's social standing at the country club suffered when members learned about the family property dispute that resulted in police documentation. Mom's book club grew uncomfortable when she continued trying to take credit for my success while simultaneously claiming victim status. The most lasting consequence was the establishment of clear boundaries. My family's requests for loans, advice, or access to my resources now went through my attorney, who maintained professional standards that family guilt couldn't influence. 6 months later, the house renovation was complete and featured in Preservation magazine. My family learned about it the same way everyone else did, by reading the article online. The measuring tape Kavya left behind still sits in my junk drawer, a reminder that some people will plan your entire future without consulting you about the present.